Well, good morning. Let's begin studying the Maimer, the discourse Lahavin Inyan Tchias HaMesim. We're learning about the resurrection of the dead, which is a very intriguing concept at the best of times, and especially in the context of what we are learning so far. So we began with a question. The question is that if you have a look in the Mishnah, it says, Kol Yisrael yesh lahem chelek la'olam haba. Every single Jewish person has a portion in the world to come. And we interpreted that the world to come means the time Olam Atchia, after Mashiach comes, when there is the resurrection of the dead. So everybody gets a portion. No pre-requirements, no limits, no, registration. You just get in, no problem. And we found that to be very intriguing and a little counterintuitive, because we know that in order to access Gan Eden, which is the experience of the neshamas after a person passes away, there are requirements. In order to get into Gan Eden, a person has to deserve it. And we said that's counterintuitive. How could it be that to have access, to be able to enjoy a more limited spiritual experience, requires more prerequisite than to access a greater spiritual experience? And in fact, we said it, an exponentially greater spiritual experience. So that's our primary question. That's what's driving this mimer. So far, we have identified, we're building a case to try and understand what's going on over here. So far what we've identified is that in order to get into Gan Eden, the prerequisite is Torah learning. And in order to gain access to Olam Haba, otherwise known as Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, the prerequisite there is mitzvahs. Not everybody learns Torah, and even if we do, not everybody learns Torah at the same level or the same depth or with the same advanced understanding. That's why Gan Eden is not necessarily equal opportunity for everybody, because the experience of what leads us to Gan Eden is personal and unique. Mitzvahs, on the other hand, we said everybody has mitzvahs. Even Poishei Yisrael, those Jews who are the so-called sinners of Israel, are meleim mitzvos karimoin. They are filled with mitzvahs as a pomegranate is filled with seeds. So that implies that everybody's got mitzvahs, and mitzvahs are the way into Olam Haba Tchias HaMesim. So everybody's got it. We're good. The only thing is that we then also learned that when the Mishnah tells us about Olam Haba, the world to come, the so-called Tchias HaMesim, it adds to that a quotation, a verse from the book of Yeshaya, which says that the Jewish people are Neitzer Mato'ai Ma'aseh Yodai Lihispoer. Hashem says the Jewish people are the branch of my planting, the work of my hands, in which I take great pride. And the implication of that is that it's being Jewish that gets you into the world to come, even without having done a mitzvah. So we need to understand this, because so far what we've said is in order to get into Gan Eden, you have to learn Torah. Not everybody learns Torah. In order to get into the world to come, you have to do mitzvahs, and everybody does mitzvahs. But on closer examination, it turns out that apparently in order to get into the world to come, you just have to be Jewish, even without doing mitzvahs. So now which one is it? Effectively, at this point in time, we've clearly got three different things we're examining. Torah learning, which is related to the disembodied experience of Gan Eden. Performance of mitzvahs, which is related to the post-messianic experience of the resurrection in its first level. And then, and it's important to emphasize this, and then a subsequent level, an experience which will happen also in the time of Tchias HaMesim, where we will be exposed to a deeper level of revelation of godliness, and that is related to who we are, the fact that we're Jewish, even before we do anything. Because that's a very brief summary of what we have learned up until this point. Currently, we're at the second paragraph of the page that you can see before you, right? V'yesh loymar. That's where we're up to. So v'yesh loymar, so he continues to explain the mashakosu b'chama drushim hu v'li'il, that there are various discourses across the spectrum of Hasidic teaching that all tell us what we've already established. Where we said that the experience of godliness that we will be exposed to in the time of Treatise, the resurrection of the dead, that will be a direct result of our doing mitzvahs. Now, just to explain what that means, because he uses the words again over here. We've seen these words before, but it's worth reiterating. He's used the words Giloi hahamshacha shenimsheches al yedei kiyum mitzvahs, which means when you do a mitzvah right now, let's say that you walk out of here, and the very next thing that you do is you give tzedakah to a poor person, let's just say, as an example. So that's a mitzvah. As soon as you do that mitzvah, there is an element of godliness. There's a divine energy that is brought into the world at large and your world in particular. That's what happens when you do a mitzvah. Every time you do a mitzvah, you bring down, the word for that is hamshacha. You bring down a divine energy into the world, your personal world and the world at large. But you don't see it. Now, if you do many, many mitzvahs, naturally you have much divine energy that surrounds you and fills our world. In fact, the Talmud even uses the expression that it would be similar to, remember once upon a time they used to wear chainmail as a form of defense. The soldiers in the medieval period used to wear chainmail. So you had these little metal scales that were all linked together to create a protective garment, say if a person was attacked, that they couldn't be stabbed or whatever the case is. So the Gemara tells us, based on a verse where the Pasuk tells us that tzedakah is like that chainmail. And based on that, the Gemara tells us, Kol pruta upruta mitztarefes lecheshbon gadol. Every little coin that you give to tzedakah adds up and adds up and adds up until eventually it's a huge amount of credit of mitzvah that you have done. Yes, it's talking about tzedakah. Yes, it's talking about coins. The reality is that it applies equally to all mitzvahs. They compound. So every time you do a mitzvah, it draws some element of divine energy into the world at large and into your personal world, and it compounds. Over the course of time, more and more of that energy collects around you, but you don't see it. You're completely unaware of it. When Mashiach comes and we have the experience of Treatise, the resurrection of the dead, then we'll actually see that energy. So that's the first thing that we learned. The mitzvahs are not only a prerequisite. In order to qualify to get to the world to come, you have to do mitzvahs. It's not a prerequisite as much as it creates my world to come. It creates that divine experience that I will have at a future time. So that's what's explained in many places in Chassidus. So the reason we explain that is, Ki sham medubar behaschar liyisrael sheyu b'olam haba avur avedasam b'torah mitzvahs b'olam hazeh. Those discourses are all specifically in the context of talking about how we will be rewarded for mitzvahs in the world to come. So we should never make the mistake of thinking because we're talking about a particular experience that is automatically the whole experience. It's in context. In the particular context of they were talking about what do mitzvahs do for you? How do you get to experience the power and the greatness and the spirituality of mitzvahs in the future? This is how it is. Every mitzvah generates this, so to speak, spiritual aura, this divine energy around you, and in the time of the resurrection it will be revealed. When I'm having that conversation in that context, then what I say is the ultimate experience of the revelation, the ultimate experience of reward for mitzvahs is to see in real time and to feel in a tangible way what the mitzvahs did. Therefore, if that's the context of all of those discourses in Chassidus, in the same context that says mitzvahs generate the energy that I'll experience as a person in the time of Treatise HaMeisim, in the same context I say Torah generates the energy that my soul will enjoy in Gan Eden. It's a continuation, right? We're examining what does Torah do for you? What do mitzvahs do for you? Mitzvahs give you the exposure to this great divine revelation that will happen in the time of the resurrection. Torah gives you exposure to the divine revelation that will happen in Gan Eden. The Torah, okay, so now in order to understand this, we have to go back to one of the core principles of how Chassidus it describes Hashem's interaction with the world. So what we're going to do is we're going to say Torah is one kind of energy, mitzvahs are another kind of energy, and we're going to speak about the comparison between these two energies. This is critical information for us to understand what's happening next in the Maimer. So let's first get these two principles clear, and then of course from that we can develop what's going to come next. So he says, the Torah hi chochmasa shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu or hamemale. Because Torah is primarily, what is Torah at the end of the day? What's Torah? So the Encyclopedia of Judaism. I mean, what is Torah? Torah is another interesting subject. There are people who study astronomy, there are people who study philosophy, and lahavdil are people who study Torah. What is Torah? Torah is God's wisdom in book form. It's an incredible gift that he gave us, that Hashem distilled his own wisdom, which is completely infinite, and he put it into words that you and I can read. So, for example, you open up the Chumash and you read a story. It's wonderful. What a pleasure. Reading a story, how difficult is that? And the story has characters, and sometimes the characters are relatable. For example, people will tell you that you should never spoil your children because look what happened with Yaakov when he gave special attention to Yosef. Oh, it's relatable. I get it. And you could walk out of there and you can say, they were people as we are people. They had issues as we have issues. And the Bible is really good to us because it allows us an opportunity to read up on other people's experiences and to learn for ourselves. And that would be a terrible misunderstanding of what Torah is. It's not a book of stories. It's just that Hashem, in his infinite capacity, is so powerful that he can take his infinite wisdom and he can compress it into a story that you and I can read, and we can even tell our children, and they can imagine in their mind's eye what that story looked like. The thing we have to be careful of is not to now think that the story is the be-all and end-all of what that information. It's not at all. That's just the wrapper. Inside that story is divine wisdom. So that's what Torah is. It's divine wisdom packaged for human consumption. That's what the Torah is. In order for Torah to work, it engages a particular kind of energy which is called Or HaMemale, the so-called filling light. We're going to come back to that and see exactly what it is. But first, let's make a comparison to mitzvahs, and then we'll find the other term, and we'll compare the two terms. So all of that is going to be rewarded in Gan Eden, the world of souls. The greatness of the world of resurrection is that that's a time when we will be exposed to the incredible godliness that is activated through mitzvahs. And that is what we call Hashem's will as opposed to Hashem's wisdom. And that is what we call Or HaSoivev as opposed to Or HaMemale. Okay, so what's going on over here? Let's understand. We're very fortunate that Hashem designed us, that we should be able to observe ourselves and analyze ourselves. And based on that, we should be able to understand things about Hashem. It's a kindness that he did for us. From observing my own flesh, I can understand things about God. That's how he designed us. You look at a person has these two components. We have intellect and we have ratzon, which you could translate as will or perhaps as motivation. They're totally different systems. Intellect, well, we all know what intellect, hopefully, we all know what intellect is. What's intellect? Intellect is a process that we use to come to understand and appreciate things in a logical way, in a sequential way. That's how intellect works. So intellect says, first you need to understand this principle. Once you understand that principle, then you can build on the next principle. So first you need to know what 1 + 1 is. Once you understand the principle of addition, simple addition, 1 + 1, you can then develop that principle, and you can develop the principle to the point where you could say, oh, you know what? Not only is there 1 + 1 simple addition, but there could be compound addition. 13 + 26 + 42. So we build. That's how we build. The intellect builds on itself. The second thing about intellect is it's completely relative. Relative to the individual and relative to the subject matter. You could have two people sitting in the same class, with the same teacher, studying the same material. Let's say, for argument's sake, that the material is scientific in nature. The one person who's sitting in class is scientifically minded. The other person sitting in class is autistic. So the scientifically minded person loves this kind of stuff and resonates with it and gets it and understands it and is able in a relatively short period of time to share that information with other people because they really get it. The person who's creative and autistic just doesn't speak to them. It's not that they're not intelligent, they just have a different intelligence. So the nature of intellect is not only is it sequential, so it builds step by step, but it's also personal. Not everybody has the same intellect, and therefore not everybody relates to the same intellectual information in the same way. So we're sitting now learning a Maimon. And right now we're talking about learning Torah and what it will do for us and how it gives us access to this wisdom of Hashem and thereby to Gan Eden. And you could all be thinking totally different things about that because you may have a different perception of what Gan Eden is. You may have studied a lot of Chassidus, so you might be very familiar with the concept of Memale Kol Olmin. This could be the first time you're hearing any of this information, so it's completely overwhelming. That's the nature of Seichel. It's personal. And if it's personal, it is individualized. We call that Memale. Memale means to fill. So just imagine for 1 second that you had a whole series of containers in front of you. Let's say one of them was a cup that holds, call it 125 milliliters. Another thing was a bottle that contains 750 milliliters. The other thing that you had was a little bowl that could contain 2 liters. And then you had a big bucket that could contain 20 liters. Now you've got water. So the Memale system is very simple. Into the cup, you can only pour 125 milliliters. And into the bucket, you can pour 20 liters. That would be considered Memale. You fill each thing according to what it needs. That means that you're aware, you're conscious of the individual. Now, it's no different with a teacher. No different. Teacher has a whole series of students. This student is more scientifically minded. That student is more creative. This student is more intelligent. That student battles a little bit. This student likes to work things out on their own. This student needs to be spoon-fed. So as a teacher, it's memale. I have to know, how do I fill each member of the classroom with exactly what it is that they need? Torah is a fundamentally memale form of engagement between Hashem and us. Hashem looks at us as individuals and says, here's a part of Torah that will speak to you. You enjoy the kind of thing that is esoteric? By all means. Books of Chassidus, books of Kabbalah. You enjoy legal things? By all means. There's a whole Gemara and a Rambam and Shulchan Aruch. You enjoy history? Go ahead, read the Tanakh and all of the Midrashim. You enjoy philosophy? We'll give you a Moira HaNevuchim or a Sefer HaIkrim or a Rabbeinu Bechai or whatever it is. So the Torah is designed to be quite personal. Now, the only thing is that in order to relate to individuals on a personal level, clearly you have to be somehow, to some extent, in their space. So the teacher is obviously more brilliant than the students, right? The teacher has already finished school and the students are in grade 1. So the teacher is obviously more advanced. But it's a grade 1 teacher. That means that the teacher knows how to relate to the reality of grade 1 students. If you had to bring somebody from MIT and expect them to teach grade 1 students, or you give Valt, you can only imagine what a disaster that would be. And they'll all walk out of there and say, we didn't understand a thing, and that person's useless. So the Torah is Hashem's way of being relatable. Hashem's way of coming into our space, acknowledging us for who we are, speaking a language that we can appreciate, coming, so to speak, down to our level. Incidentally, that's one of the reasons that the Torah is compared to water, because water always flows downward. So the Torah flows down. It's Hashem coming down into our reality, making things that are accessible to us. The experience called Ratzoin is altogether different. What's Ratzoin? So again, people will translate Ratzoin as will, or Ratzoin as motivation. And motivation might be a stronger word. Let's not confuse Ratzoin with the things that I would like to have. So right now, as we're sitting here right now, it's quite possible that you're thinking, I really should have fixed a coffee before I sat down to the shiur because I'm a little bit tired, so I'd like to have a coffee. That's not a Ratzoin in the deep sense that we're describing Ratzoin over here. That's something you would like to have. So what happens if you don't have the coffee? What's going to happen? You know, those people have the t-shirt that says, nice person, just add coffee. What's the worst thing that will happen if you don't have coffee? You'll be a little bit edgy. You'll be a little bit tired. You'll survive. If a person had to go without coffee, I know everybody says, if I had to go without coffee for X amount of time, by the way, you shouldn't be drinking coffee now anyway, right? We're going up to a fast day. Don't they say you're supposed to detox in advance? People say, if I never had coffee, I don't know what would happen. I don't know how you do it, how you don't drink coffee. Trust me. If you don't have coffee, you'll survive. If there's no option, you'll learn how to survive. Because it's not a true ratzon. It's something I'd like to have. It's not something that defines the motivation of who I am. Ratzon is the motivation of who I am. So let's say, for argument's sake, you've got a particular dream that you've had your whole life. This is your thing, and everybody has their thing. This is your thing that you really want to succeed at. This is your thing that you've always dreamt of. This is what you believe is going to give you value as a human being. This will leave your mark on the world. This is something you care about with every fiber of your being. That's what we call ratzon. And the distinction there is that coffee you might think about in the morning, you might think about again during the course of the day. Most of the day you won't necessarily think about it. Your real deepest ratzon will keep coming up. It will keep, and whenever it comes up, you'll switch on. You'll be alive. That's why if you teach students and you're able to bring out something that they could relate to, so you're in that grade 1 classroom and you speak a language that it's something that they care about, suddenly they come alive. Suddenly they're thinking and they're engaged and they're not staring out the windows and they're not poking each other's and throwing things at each other, because ratzon activates the entire system. Ratzon is not personal to anybody else. Ratzon is all about me. It's what I want. You may never relate to it. This is my dream. This is my ambition. This is my drive. It could be something that to you is completely off the wall. As far as you're concerned, it's irrelevant, it's unimportant, and it certainly would mean nothing in your life. Doesn't matter. That's not going to diminish my ratzon. My ratzon is mine. So that's what we call soivev kol olmin, something that is greater than us. So it encompasses us. Memale is an energy that fills us. Soivev is an energy that encompasses us. There are two ways in which Hashem connects. He connects to us through Torah in a very personal way. As you learn Torah, and anybody will know this, by the way, as you learn Torah, so you develop a sense of, I am more personally connected to Hashem. That's actually how you start to feel. It starts to become real to you. That's why any time that a person is grappling with an issue in faith or whatever, learn Torah, because it makes it real. It sinks in. It becomes personal. You own it. It's yours. That's the nature of Torah. The nature of mitzvahs is a different channel of connection to Hashem. The nature of mitzvahs is every single one of us, from Moshe Rabbeinu to the Jewish person who gets stopped on a street corner by a Chabadnik to put on tefillin and he has absolutely no idea why he's doing it. The mitzvah is of equal value. Why? Because the energy was not defined by us, because it is not tailor-made for us. It's Hashem's ratzon. It's greater than us. It is soivev. It completely transcends us. So these are the two energies. In Gan Eden, a soul is given the exposure of memale, the lesser energy of godliness, which was already tailor-made, designed, compressed for human experience. Now the neshama enjoys it. When you learn Torah, you didn't see the holiness of it. You saw the intellectual value of it. Neshama goes to Gan Eden, you start to see the holiness of it. Mitzvahs, that's a mega kind of energy, way beyond anything that I could appreciate and understand, and I'll only be exposed to that when Mashiach comes, and specifically in the time of the resurrection. I'm second last line of the second paragraph on the page, middle paragraph on the page. What they do both have in common, the Gan Eden experience and the resurrection experience, the value of Torah learning and the value of mitzvahs, what they both have in common is that both Gan Eden and that experience of the resurrection of the dead are both so-called reward for our efforts. We put in the effort to learn Torah, we get something for that, an experience in Gan Eden. We put in the effort to do mitzvahs, we get something for that, the experience of the resurrection of the dead. But the Iker HaChidish v'ha'iloi שיהיה בעולם הבא הוא הגילוי דמלס ישראל עצמם נעצם התוים מהיסוד לספור. But the ultimate experience of Tchias HaMeis and resurrection of the dead, the ultimate experience of the world to come, is not what Hashem gives us because we did Torah or because we did mitzvahs. The ultimate experience of the world to come is where Hashem exposes who we are. Not what we've done, who we are. The greatness, the infinite greatness of who we are. And this is the real power that we're going to be learning about in this Maimer. So with that, we go now to Ois Dalet, paragraph Dalet, the bottom of the page. We need to now explain what the difference is between these three experiences. Gan Eden, related to Torah and related to Memale Kol Almin. The first stage of the resurrection related to mitzvahs and related to Sovev Kol Almin. And the ultimate stage of the resurrection, which is related to the core value of us as who we are, the value of our neshamas, the value of being Jewish, and we don't yet know what level that relates to. Or bi'ur ha'inyan, so in order to explain this concept further, the Gimel Madregas Gan Eden obeys Hadargas B'trias HaMeisim, in order to explain the difference between the Gan Eden exposure and the two levels of exposure that will happen at the time of the resurrection. So in order to understand that, we're going to explain a fundamental difference between that so-called world to come and the time of Gan Eden. The Isa Bi Gemara, the Gemara teaches us, Kol Anavim Kulon Lo Nisnabu El Limois HaMoshiach. We know that the prophets speak at great length about the time of Moshiach. So much so that the Rambam tells us that all of the books of the prophets are filled with prophecies about the time of Mashiach. Now, you can only prophesy about something if you have some kind of an insight, right? The prophecy means that they had some kind of a glimpse of that reality. So the prophets were capable of predicting what's going to happen when Mashiach comes. Aval ha'olam haba ayin lo ra'asa elokim zulasecha. But the next world, meaning the time of the Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection of the dead, no eye has ever perceived it besides Hashem. That means even the greatest prophet who ever lived, who could tell us everything that's going to happen in the future all the way up until that point, is as blind to the reality, the experience of the resurrection as you and I are. And of course, you and I, we're not prophets. I don't know about you, but I'm certainly not a prophet. So it's incredible to imagine that people had such insight and such prophecy were completely unable to see that reality. That tells you something. That tells you that prophecy can get you to an incredibly high spiritual place, and this is still exponentially beyond that. So to understand this, we're going to use words that you're familiar with, but sometimes that's the problem. Sometimes when we're familiar with words, that's when we don't allow ourselves the opportunity to actually learn them properly. It says the Gemara, what does it mean that no eye has seen this world to come? Says the Gemara there, Ze Eden. This refers to Eden. Shaloi shalta boy ein kol beria. No creature's eye has ever had access to see this reality called Eden. Now, there's an example of something that unfortunately we do, right? We just throw terms around and we don't necessarily know exactly what the nuance of distinction is between one term and another. So very often you'll find that people use interchangeably the expression Gan Eden and the expression Eden. Maybe not so much in English, because I think in English when people use the word Eden, usually they actually mean the original Eden where Adam and Eve were. And when people say Gan Eden, they're usually referring to the world of souls. But we often interchangeably use those words. Gan Eden, Eden, it's all the same thing. Well, it's really not. It's really not the same thing. And the Gemara makes that clear. The Gemara says, Eden, no eye of any creature ever had the capacity to experience Eden. Asks the Gemara, Shema toimar Adam arishoin heichan haya. Then you'll say, where was Adam? Adam Arishan, where was Adam? Was he not in Eden? Isn't that what everybody tells you? That Adam was in Eden? What do you mean? Nobody ever saw it. Adam was there. Answers the Gemara, Began chulei. He was in the Garden of Eden. Isn't that funny? We use that expression all the time and we don't actually ever stop to think what it means. The Garden of Eden. That tells you that the Garden and Eden are not the same thing. Because otherwise we would have called it the Garden Eden. Garden Eden, right? The Garden, Eden. The garden known as Eden. We don't say that. We say the Garden of Eden. It's one of the few times the English translation is actually on the mark. It's a garden that belongs to another reality called Eden. much like your own house. You have your house and you have your garden. And the garden's not the house. You don't sleep in the garden. I mean, unless, maybe sometimes the husbands do. If you really step out of line. It's not the house. There's a house and there's a garden attached. There's an Eden and there's a gun attached. Says the Gemara very clearly, Gan lechud, ve'Eden lechud. Gan is one concept, the garden. Eden is a separate, independent concept called Eden. That's why, for example, if you look in the early part of the Chumash, it tells us, V'nahar yotzei me Eden lahashkois es hagan, that a river flowed from Eden to irrigate the garden. Which garden? The Garden of Eden. Okay, this is quite valuable information for us to understand that there's this distinction, that there is a reality called Eden and there's a reality called Gan, and they're not the same. It's very useful information for us. It's just as useful, probably more useful, to understand that neither of those refers to a physical reality. So let's understand, what is it? So if you really want to appreciate what's so special about the time of the resurrection of the dead and what makes it greater than the period of Mashiach and even greater than Gan Eden, it's because the time of the resurrection there will be an exposure of Eden. Now we need to know what Eden is, because this is going to be the pivot on which we're going to build our whole understanding of what's really going to happen in the time of the resurrection. It's all going to build on this concept called Eden. So we need to understand, what is Eden? Eden that nobody's seen, that nobody's experienced, that nobody can access, that even the prophets can't imagine. What is it? Words in Hebrew are very specific, and words in Hebrew always carry a deeper meaning than just what you would see at face value. So if you understand the meaning of the word Eden, it will help to understand where this place is, where the spiritual reality is, what dimension of spirituality is this Eden. So let's see. We then move on. What we can understand so far, the fact that in the time of the resurrection, the world to come, there will be a divine revelation that is linked to and associated with the mitzvahs that we have done, considering that we will already start to have exposure to reward for our mitzvahs, even in the time of Mashiach, before the resurrection, because the Seder is supposed to be, the order is supposed to be that first Mashiach comes, and then there's a period of time. Exactly how long that period of time is and exactly what happens during that period of time is debated between the various early commentators. But there is a period of time before the resurrection of the dead. And already in that period of time of Mashiach, we start to have reward for having done mitzvahs. So the fact that that is already available in the time of Mashiach before the resurrection, so that then tells me that can't be the real experience of the world to come, for a very logical reason. Everything is graded, right? How do we differentiate between our world, Gan Eden, the time of Mashiach, and the world to come? How do we differentiate between them? Because they're different degrees of godly revelation. So if in the time of Mashiach there's already the revelation associated with doing mitzvahs, then that can't be the unique factor of the time of the resurrection. There's got to be something else. We've got to work out what that something else is. So what is that something else? The ultimate of what will be revealed in the time of the Treatise and resurrection of the dead is what is called Eden. Now, what does Eden mean in Hebrew? V'hu hatainug ha'atzmi shemis'aneg b'Yisrael shelamayla gam mehatainug shemis'aneg b'mitzvahs. You know what Eden is? It's this intense essence of pleasure that Hashem derives from us as we are us, which is deeper than the tainuk pleasure that he derives from doing mitzvahs. Okay, what does that mean? Well, first of all, we've already described that there is seichel and ratzon, two different ways that a person can experience something. You tell me, when you learn something and you get it, and maybe it was difficult to learn, maybe it was a really abstract concept and it took a lot of time until eventually you chapped it. So tell me something. When you chap it, isn't that satisfying? Isn't that amazing? Don't you feel great? Possibly one of the most satisfying experiences that a person can ever have is an intellectual appreciation of something. It's actually deeper and more compelling than the satisfaction, let's say, of having a good meal. Sometimes you sit down, oh, that was so delicious. But when you learn something, it makes sense. It's like, wow, there's an excitement. You're switched on. Why? Because intellect is one of the greatest assets that a human being has. It's what distinguishes us from the rest of creation. It's what puts us on a pedestal. So if you can activate a part of me that is who I am, intellect is who I am, it's what distinguishes me. I'm not an animal. I can think, I can philosophize, I can understand, I can research, I can appreciate, So you've spoken to something really deep. I feel exhilarated. You've switched on a big part of me. I'm on top of the world. Ratzon is deeper than that, which means that if a person has a very strong desire for something, a very strong drive for something, a real ambition, something that you care about, something that defines your life, something that you believe in so strongly, you're fighting for it, you're tenacious about it, you don't let the obstacles get in your way, you keep pushing yourself, what will it feel like when you eventually succeed? Think about it. I mean, we've all had this experience, right? Something that you really pushed for, that you really cared about, that was difficult, but you were committed anyway. How do you feel when you've reached that milestone? Even more exhilarated than when you've understood something. Because now you're talking to an even deeper part of who I am. You're talking about something that defines me. Intellect, yes, everybody who is human has intellect. And a whole bunch of us have this kind of intellect, and a whole bunch of us have that kind of intellect. So it's kind of a little bit more generic, even though it's very uplifting and very satisfying. But my unique personal drive, my personal dream, that business I wanted to get off the ground, that idea that I believed was going to change the world, that principle that I live for, and I'll teach everybody that principle. Whenever I see success in that area, the whole of me is on fire. You can't say my brain is satisfied. You can't say my stomach is satisfied. I am a different person. You see this? You see this when a person is working with their ratzon and succeeding with their ratzon and overcoming obstacles and achieving objectives, that person is pumped. That person has a reason to live. That person exudes energy. That person inspires other people because you can just see how alive they are with the thing that they care about. Now, the deeper dimension of ratzon is tainug, which means subconsciously, I actually know how pleasurable it will be to achieve my ratzon. So what drives my ratzon is the sense, and it's not a conscious sense, it's a subconscious sense of how beautiful it will feel and what the experience will be and how full it will be and how uplifting it will be. That's actually what drives. In other words, tainug, the deepest form of pleasure, not pleasure that is transient. Oh, I'm enjoying something. Oh, wow, that's so tasty. This is so exciting. That's so beautiful. No, not that kind of pleasure. Pleasure that you feel in your bones. Pleasure that says life is worth living for this. Pleasure that says I have realized the core of my being. That kind of pleasure, that's what we call tainug. That's what he calls here tainug atzmi. Pleasure that sits at the core of my being. So let's do a little exercise over here for a second. One of the deepest pleasures that a person will ever have in their life is called nachas. Nachas that really doesn't even have an English translation. Nachas that can't really be described. Imagine somebody had to ask you, please write an essay of 120 words on nachas. It's ridiculous. You can't put it into the written word. Nachas is so deep, so beautiful, so exhilarating. That's what we would call an example of tainug atzmi. It's a pleasure that I feel in the core of my being. So you could have the pleasure of tasty food, which is nice, while it lasts. And you experience it in the digestive experience, in the taste experience, in the smell experience. The other parts of the body that are completely immune. What does a good piece of food do for your shoulder? Not much. You might look at a piece of art and wow, I get such pleasure from looking at this piece of art. It's beautiful. The beauty brings me to an emotional state. Okay? So where's this pleasure hit you? In emotion, in artistic appreciation within your brain. What does a piece of art do for your empty stomach? Nothing. Let's say that a person listens to a magnificent piece of music. You go listen to a symphony. It can completely transport you to a whole different place. No matter what's going on in your life, no matter what stress you have, no matter what's bothering you, you're in such a serene place. You don't have a care in the world. The music is so beautiful. But it's not tainug atzmi. It's not at the essence of your being. Nachas speaks to the essence of my being. People will tell you when you have nachas, you feel that you could just live. You're not distracted. You're not even hungry. You're so caught up and wrapped in this experience. So you go to parent-teachers evening. Go to parent-teachers evening. The teacher sits down over there and the teacher tells you, listen, your child, Moishele, is doing really well, and the class has been studying this, and the class has been studying that, and they give you this whole intellectual thing with graphs and statistics and IQs and expectations and projections, I hear a whole thing, and this is where your child is on the curve. A purely intellectual description compared to the average, compared to the rest of the class. This is where your child is on the curve. You walk out of there feeling what? You walk out, okay, I'm happy. Sounds good. I don't really understand the curve. I haven't really researched these things, but apparently, my kid is pretty high up on the curve. Must be a good thing. Intellectually, I have a satisfaction. I have a sense of satisfaction. Go to parent-teachers evening, and the teacher says, your little Moishele, what a mensch. What a lovely kid. He does his work well. He's attentive in class. He participates. But really, the thing that I love about him, he just looks out for the other kids in the class. He's just got the sensitivity. How do you feel now? How do you feel? Do you feel the same as this point on the curve? Do you feel the same as he's done well, he got an A on his test? No, you've heard something about the beauty of your child. Not just about his academic ability, the beauty of your child. Your child is a beautiful human being. You walk on air. You just want to go home and give that child a big hug and a kiss. You're such a beautiful individual. That's nachas. Nachas brings me this pleasure deep inside. Pleasure that makes me, that justifies life, that puts me into a whole different frame. And then sometimes you come home from the parent-teachers evening and there was nothing special to say. Child did okay at school. He's meeting all the milestones, the expectations. He's passing in his academics. He's socially balanced. Nothing spectacular, nothing earth-shattering. The teacher comes across pretty average. You walk out of there feeling okay, satisfied. You walk through the door, you walk into little Moishele's room, he's fast asleep. At this point in time, he's not achieving academically, and he's not interacting socially, and he's not listening to your instructions, and he's not playing with toys, and he's not expressing art. He just is. He's lying in his bed. You walk into his room, and you look at him fast asleep over there, and you suddenly feel this intense, incredible love and nachas for that child. And you can't pin it down to anything in particular. You cannot say that it's because of what he did, what he achieved, what he learned, who he touched. It just is. It is even possible that that kind of feeling, that kind of pleasure, that kind of nachas might even be deeper than the nachas when you got such an amazing report from the child's teacher. Because this is nachas of who that child is, not what that child has done. I love who that child is. That child, just the fact that they exist makes me feel unbelievable. Just the fact that they open their eyes, just the fact they walk in the room, or as they sleep, they're doing absolutely nothing. That child gives me the greatest pleasure in the whole world. That's Eden. That's Tainug Atzmi. That is the most intense kind of pleasure that is not a factor of anything that has happened, anything that has been achieved, anything that has been done, anything that has been taught, celebrated. This is Tainug, pleasure, enjoyment, nachas, because it is beyond intellect, beyond reason, beyond explanation, beyond emotion, beyond even being my ambition in life. My child's not my ambition. I don't get nachas from the child because I feel I achieved my life's dream. I get nachas from the child because I know that that child is really part of me. Even as they are separate physically, they're part of me. That's what's going to happen in the experience of the resurrection of the dead. Tainug Atzmi, an exposure of Hashem's absolute nachas, absolute love, absolute joy and pleasure from the fact that we are, not from the fact that we have achieved. Ulahoyer, last line on the page. It's important to note that in many places in Hasidus we describe the difference between Torah and mitzvahs. The b'Torah, when you deal with Torah, shehi chachmasa yisbarich, which is Hashem's wisdom. So whenever you engage with Torah, which is Hashem's wisdom, then all you get is meluvash he'oras hatainug. All you get is a glimmer of Hashem's pleasure. Over mitzvah shehem ritzoni yisbarich meluvash atzmus hatainug bechinas Eden. And when we talk about mitzvahs, that's when you get to experience Hashem's actual tainug and pleasure, the so-called level of Eden. Just like we said, when the teacher tells you intellectually about how brilliant your child is, intellectually on a scale, so you get some level of pleasure, you get some level of nachas, you do get nachas. When your teacher tells you what your child does as a human being, ratzoin, they live up to the values that you care about. They don't just pass the tests and know the subject matter. They live up to what you care about. Much deeper level of tainug. Torah, mitzvahs. Torah is an experience when a neshama goes to Gan Eden. It gets an experience of a glimmer of one element or aspect of Hashem's pleasure in us. When you go to Tchias HaMesim and you experience mitzvahs, it's a whole different and deeper level of His pleasure in us. And as we're going to say, and that's still not the ultimate. So I'm going to just go quickly from here to the end of the paragraph just to round it all off. That's why the Torah tells us regarding Gan Eden that a river flowed out of Eden to irrigate the garden. Meaning, this imagery of a flowing river coming from a source to the garden to irrigate it, that's the image of divine flow from a higher realm flowing down into Gan Eden to give us a sense of exposure, a sense of pleasure, of godliness. Just like if you had to go to a flowing river and it was fresh, cool water, so it would be an amazing thing, obviously, to drink that water. It's refreshing. But it's important to know that it's only a minuscule, limited version of divine revelation. Whereas in the time of the resurrection, the world to come, there we will be exposed not to an element of divine revelation, but to complete divine revelation. Now talking to the essence of what we want to achieve in our Maimer. That distinction between Gan Eden and the world to come, that's speaking in general terms. In general terms, Gan Eden is a limited degree of divine revelation, and the world to come is a much greater degree of divine revelation. I will be proteus, but more specifically, ואף על פי כן אמרו שבמועד המשיח לא יגידו בבחינת עין לרעס ובבחינת עדן ויגידו בבחינת זו יהיה רק בעולם הבא. However, as we already noted before, the fact that already in the time of Mashiach we'll start to have some of the experience of the divine revelation, which is the result of doing mitzvahs, and we're also told that the world to come, the period of the resurrection, nobody can perceive, not even using the lens of prophecy. Muchach mizeh, it is obvious, she'ikar b'chinas eden she'eh b'olam haba hu, שאז יסגל התענוג העצמי שמסנג בישראל שלמעלה גם מהתענוג העצמי שבמצוות. That indicates to us that the primary experience of divine revelation that will happen in the time of the resurrection is Tainug Atzmi. So let's explain it. Gan Eden, we will get the feeling of the pleasure Hashem has from us, similar to the feeling that you get at the parent-teachers meeting when you're told that your child is doing well academically and they're on the curve. So in your mind, you know that this is a good thing and it feels very satisfying and you feel good about it. That's the experience of satisfaction that the neshama will have in Gan Eden. When Mashiach comes, that will be like somebody saying, look what an amazing person your child is, which gives you so much more nachas, so much more pride, so much more joy, so much more pleasure. My child is not just a walking brain. My child is a mensch. My child is sensitive. Wow. That's what happens when Mashiach comes. We get to enjoy the pleasure not only of the fact that we have studied godliness, but that we do what Hashem wants. And then in the period of the resurrection, which is the ultimate revelation, that's when we have the exposure of the incredible nachas and pride and joy and pleasure that Hashem has from the fact that we exist. Like when you watch your child sleeping and you just feel so happy that they are in your life. Even though right now they're not doing anything to earn that happiness. And even though right now you're not thinking about what they may have done in the past to earn that happiness, just the fact that they are the deepest pleasure that you could possibly have. That's the exposure and experience that we will have at the time of Tchias HaMesim, the resurrection. Now with that in mind, we'll do a further exploration of the distinction between the different levels to get us to a point to understand why it is that there are entry requirements to get into Gan Eden and not to get into the time of the resurrection. By now we've planted an incredibly important seed. You can probably already see how what we have learned will help us to answer that question.